to have you here. Now, the next speaker on the panel will be Rosa Maria Paya, someone that already has been introduced by the congressman, but someone that here in the parliament and just in the parliament doesn't really need an introduction. And with her, I think we will now complete, let's say, an overview of how people with the closest ties to their countries and their citizens really have, and we will then proceed with other representatives, other panelists. Rosa Maria, you have the floor, please.
Thank you so much, Vice President Eliška, Congressman and friend Diaz-Valar, Ambassador, members of the panel, members of the Parliament. Thank you so much for this invitation and truly honored by this opportunity. I will start by thanking this Parliament for the resolution approved about the agreement that the EU had previously signed with the Cuban dictatorship. Thank you very much for taking side with those who defend the values of human rights and democracy in Cuba, as well as in Venezuela. These are the democratic principles that we share with Europe and the reason that gather us today. Dictators, on the other hand, have another scale of values, that of holding onto power no matter what cost, both in material and human terms. That is why it is very painful and dangerous when some representatives of this union assume that the enemies of the democracy are their interlocutors in Cuba. Castro and Diaz-Canel remain in power by the use of force instead of free elections, which does not make them legitimate representatives of the Cuban people. Therefore, they are not pairs to the elected representative of the European democracies. Rights have no political color, nor depend on race, nor on culture. Neither dictatorships have political color. They are not from the right, not from the left. They are just dictatorships. Those were the words of my father, Oswaldo Paya, 17 years ago, addressing the states of the European Union in his speech of acceptation of the Sakharov Prize. In that moment, his message went around the world, bringing hope for all Cubans. Yet, the cowardice of a power as absolute as it is criminal never dared to broadcast it in Cuba, where the public media are in the practice sequestered as the private property of the elite in power. The same elite that 10 years later, in 2012, was to order the assassination of my father, Oswaldo Paya, and Harold Cepero in an attack executed by agents of the dictatorship. The Cuban people face right now a cruel scarcity that is increasing among the population because in a communist totalitarianism, property does not depend on self-effort. The authorities harass, penalize, and persecute the citizens so that the search for the daily bread has become a crime, and most families have no options to escape poverty. However, our people have not stopped rebelling against this oppression. Social discontent and protest increases despite the repression. Today, there are more than 140 documented cases of men and women locked up in Cuba for thinking differently and acting in line with their conscience, according to the Cuban prisoner defenders, as the Dr. Eduardo Cardé, and brave women as Aymara Nieto. Castroism is not opening but closing all doors to democracy with the recent imposition of their illegitimate constitutional reform, which allows the use of weapons against anyone who intends to change the political, social, and economic system. I'm being literal here. Contrary to the propaganda that was spread by a part of the international press, the reforms announced in Cuba are implemented precisely with the aim of perpetuating the Communist Party in power and not to disregard communism, as you might have read in El País, for example. That's why it was disappointing when the Foreign Service of the European Union actually insults the intelligence of the Cuban people by calling the unconsulted regime of Havana a single-party democracy. The European Union has signed a dialogue and cooperation agreement with this regime, but without including in the praxis the Cuban independent civil society and actually the Cuban citizens in any dialogue, cooperation, and much less in trade, not because of Europe, but because Cubans are forbidden by law and by constitution to participate in the political life as well as in the economic life of our own nation. We are a people banned by the government to freely generate and enjoy wealth, much as we are marginalized even from the cultural life when it comes to express any alternative opinion from the official point of view of the state. The Cuban regime is in the antipodes of the foundational values of this House, and they should be regarded as single-party apartheid and not as a single-party democracy, which was the oxymoron used. Cynicism does not make politics more realistic or more efficient. In fact, it will empty politics from its fundamental reason of searching for the common good. When those who have the power to act in the free world remain in silence, they are supporting the impunity of tyrants around the globe. The impunity with which the Cuban regime murdered my father, Oswaldo Paya, and my friend, the young leader Harold Cepero, in July 2012. I now remember the relevance of the words of the former Czech president, Václav Havel, in the letter he wrote to my father. He said, Europe should clearly manifest that Castro is a dictator, and that a dictatorship cannot be the interlocutor of a democratic country until they launch a process of political distension. Not only Cubans suffer when the international community remains in silence. Tolerating the dictatorship in Cuba for 60 years has affected the stability of the democracies in the Americas, as we just heard, and has caused serious threat to the national security of several states. It is well known the invasive role of the Havana regime and its repressive apparatus in the decline that democracy has suffered in our region. Many democratic governments are victims of the attempts of destabilization by forces related with the Cuban dictatorship. The intelligence agency of the Castroians, known as G2, has infiltrated the entire hemisphere, from social movement to guerrillas, and it still maintains a military presence in Venezuela. During many years, Cuba has served as a center for the spread of the authoritarian models, including the so-called socialism of the 21st century, besides being a sanctuary for terrorists from all over the world. However, the Cuban regime is going through one of the deepest crises in its history. Due to popular discontent, the disappearance of the historic dictator, the decrease of the international support, the worsening of the economic crisis, and the increase in local protest and the rejection by the Cuban citizens on the island and abroad, which became obvious in February this year during the fraudulent referendum that basically showed that the Cubans do not approve a constitution imposed by the Communist Party to perpetuate itself in power. We are living decisive moments, and we are grateful to the support that this Parliament has given to the cause of freedom in Cuba through the years. That is why I want to invite you all to take one more step to support the Cuban people by the following joint actions. First, to identify and publicly denounce the intelligence and repression apparatus of the Cuban regime, the G2, for its interference in Venezuela and throughout the region, and for its crimes inside and outside Cuba. Second, to denounce the illegitimacy of the new constitution intended to be imposed in Cuba, and thus the illegitimacy of the regime in power and its representatives for not having been freely chosen by the Cuban people. Third, to articulate political, diplomatic, and other pressures on those who are usurping power in Cuba so that they respect the sovereign will of the Cuban citizens in a binding plebiscite to change the system democratically. The three of them, together with the direct support to the independent Cuban civil society, might be conditions to the implementation of the agreement between the EU and Cuba. Europe has the opportunity to join forces with the democracies in the Americas, and that was the purpose of this event, in order to achieve what could be the most important victory of the 21st century, the democratization of Cuba and Venezuela, and the consequent stabilization and progress of democracy in Latin America. Thank you so much.
Rosa Maria,